I can imagine you're all a little bit disappointed because I'm not Philip Ekberg. Unfortunately, he is sick. So if you're here and you want to enjoy a talk about C# and .NET, I'm sorry, this is not the place anymore. So if you're Niels or you're interested in .NET, feel free to find another room. I won't be offended. But what I will be talking about instead is Bicep, an infrastructure as code language that Microsoft developed solely for Azure. And I've done a number of sessions where I introduced the language, like a 101, how to get started. And in this session, I want to kind of skip that and dive into some more advanced and newer features of the language. And actually, there are quite a few of them. Now, before I dive in, I'm curious, are you all experienced Bicep engineers? Who has experience? Okay, who is like, shoot, I want to see the 101? Okay, find me afterwards, because I tried to step over it this time. My name is Henry Been. I'm a developer and architect from the Netherlands. And one of the things that you learn when you start doing talks like this is that you shouldn't introduce your technical credentials. And I also like to be a little bit more about who am I. So I thought I add some pictures. This is the house that I'm living in right now. This picture is from 2 years ago. My wife and I bought a really, really terrible house in a fantastic location. And we got a contractor in and we got it stripped down completely and we got it insulated and new thatch on the roof and everything. And this was, I think, 3 months in, and you think it couldn't get any worse than this, right? Too bad. It got worse. This is the thing where we were, I think, 2 years ago. And a few weeks later, we started building up again. And at this point, I kicked out the contractor. I said, I'm done with you. I'm going to finish this house myself. So that's almost 2 years ago. And since then, I have slowly building my own house, or actually the house owned by my wife and myself. So this is my attic in March. This is my attic in May. And I'm very proud of this one, last week we completed the kitchen. I will give you one pro tip. Somebody who's building a house, never ask how it's going unless you have at least 60 to 90 minutes. Because I can talk about this for hours. But I think everybody should have at least one non-technical thing in its life, and this is consuming all my time besides tech. All right, Bicep. What's new? I thought, how am I going to approach this talk? Will I do just 45 minutes of demos and I will just keep talking and you will keep listening and listening? Or am I going to try and do something different? And I choose the second one. I'm going to try and see if we can make this a little bit more of a conversation and a little bit less of a presentation. So what I did, I prepared a number of things that I can talk about and that I can show you, which is more material than I can fit in this 50 minutes. So I want you to pick and choose what you want to see, and let's talk about what you can do with the different things that we see and when you might use it or when you might not use it. So the first thing that I want to show you is something amazing. If you have been working with Bicep and you have been flirting maybe a little bit with Terraform or looking at Pulumi at the side, one of the things that might have annoyed you is that you cannot approach Entra ID or in the past Active Directory using Bicep. There is a fix for that now, and I want to show you that before we start with the remainder. And then for the rest of the session, these are the options that I thought might be interesting to you to talk about. The first one is a number of enhancements around parameters. If you started with Bicep a couple of years ago, you still had to write those dreaded JSON files with the parameter values. There's a much better option right now. The second thing is user-defined types. If you make larger infrastructures using Bicep, you are very likely to start passing a lot of objects around. And it's hard to keep track of which properties need to go in there and of which type they need to be. And there is a solution for that now, and it's called user-defined types. We can play a little bit with the linter or the transpiler and upgrade some warnings to errors or downgrade some warnings to don't bug me, if you're interested in that. Another problem that you might have encountered with Bicep is that when you create, let's say, a server farm, an app service plan in one file, and you need to host an app service on it on another file, you need to first get the resource ID of the server farm, pass it to the other file, and then reference the existing resource and then approach properties of it. Well, you can now pass complete resources around, the complete object with all the properties. Much neater. And then a number of things that are less about the language and a little bit more about working together on infrastructures. And the first one is the Bicep registry. And the Bicep registry is nothing more than an Azure container registry, which we are misusing for not storing container images, but Bicep modules, so that we can reuse them from other contexts. And it would look something like this. We have a Bicep template which we deploy to a registry, and then once it is in the registry, we can take another Bicep template in a completely different context and reference that module in the registry and then deploy the combined architecture into Azure. And of course, all the Azure RBAC and identity and access management stuff applies here. As an alternative to the Bicep registry, you can also use template specs, where a module is stored in a container registry, so it's stored in the data plane. When you use template specs, they allow you to take a Bicep template and deploy that as a resource into Azure. So you're not creating the resources defined in the template, you are creating the template itself as a resource. And then again, you can create Azure resources out of the template spec, but you can also do the same thing as you did with the registry, reference it from another file and deploy resources that way. Now this is an interesting thing. You might be wondering, why the hell would I do that? Now I'm doing infrastructure as code, which is way better than ClickOps, and now I'm pushing a template spec into Azure so that somebody else can do ClickOps. Why? I wondered myself for a while, but I actually ran into a use case recently, and that was a data analytics team. They were very good with data analytics, and they were pretty shit at infrastructure in Azure. So they liked us to create templates which define data bricks with connectivity to the network and all the other things that they don't really care about, but that they need to do their work. And then we published that as a template spec, so they could go into the portal and create the infrastructure they needed, when they needed it, with just a few clicks. So that's a use case where I use this technology. And the final thing that's been added, I think a couple of months ago at G8, is called deployment stacks. And deployment stacks solve a very particular problem when it comes to Bicep templates in Azure. When you deploy a Bicep template, by default you deploy it in what is called incremental mode. That means when you have resources in your template but not in Azure, they are created in Azure. When you have resources in both, the properties in Azure are updated. However, what it doesn't do is remove resources in Azure that are not in your template. It is only a way for provisioning and updating and guarding against configuration drift. Now you might say, Henry, there is also complete deployment mode, which is a way Azure says that you can also remove resources from your deployment scope that are not in your template. There are a number of problems with complete deployment mode. First off, there are a number of resource types that it doesn't clean up. And examples are alert rules or airbag assignments. And the reason for this is that this weren't resources in the past, but they were upgraded to be resources somewhere along the line. And the other reason is that there is no guarantee really against somebody else deploying something into a resource group without asking you. And then when you do a complete deployment into that resource group, you're throwing away the stuff from the other person. And if that happens to be a very important database, that's really, really bad. What a deployment stack allows you to do is introduce a new type of resource grouping. So you draw a line around a number of resources, and you make sure that that corresponds one-to-one with the resources in your template. And now, when you remove a resource from your template, you can say, hey, I also want to perform a cleanup in Azure for resources that are not in my template, but are in the stack. And there are a number of scenarios that I prepared for you to quickly grab an understanding of what a stack deployment does. So let's say we have an empty Azure environment, and we're going to deploy a template with an app service and a SQL database into Azure as a stack. This is what we're going to end up with. Another scenario is where we already have the app service in Azure, we do the same thing, and we end up with the same result. So this is creating updating. Now let's say I'm going to extend my stack and also include a virtual machine for reasons unknown to me. You might need a virtual machine. Now, I have that in Azure already, and now I'm going to deploy a template without that virtual machine. And what is going to happen is that my stack is shrunk to only contain the resources defined in the template, and my virtual machine is left in Azure, but it is no longer a part of the stack. So we can now clearly identify that it should be ready for removal. Thank you very much, Teams. How about you just shut your pretty mouth? This is what the normal behavior is when you want to clean up resources. But you can also clean up resources using an extra flag, which is called -delete resources. And that will do what you probably expect it to do. It will actually do an amazing thing and throw out that stupid virtual machine. So this is how you can use deployment stacks to not even need to go into production or in any other environment anymore to remove resources you don't need anymore. So this is a new addition that I like a lot, and it's really handy, especially when you're working with multiple teams and one team needs to provision something that other teams need, or that you are working together in the same deployment scope. One final thing that a deployment stack can do is that it can be locked. And you can lock it against deletion of resources or even alteration of resources, and then say only specific service principals or users are allowed to update the stack. And this is particularly useful in cases where you're using a hub and spoke model across multiple teams for example, networking. So we have an application team that needs an app service and a SQL DB, but they need access to the virtual network that is managed by a central team, a platform team, or whatever you call it. Now, of course, that team is not going to allow people to connect stuff to that VNet. So you're going to create private endpoints for your stuff, but then connect it to a virtual network of your own and create a peering between them. Now, what you would normally see is that that central team would provision that virtual network, that peering, and probably a few other resources as well, into that decentralized resource group for the team to build on, but not to alter. And you can do that by deploying that as a template stack and then locking it against changes by anything except for the service principal used by the central team. What do you want to see? Or if you're like, whatever, I can figure this out on my own and learn. Any questions, thoughts? Yeah, go for it. So the question is, if you're using a deployment stack this way and you're going to remove a resource, don't you want to be able to have some kind of retention or a way for something to be backed up before you remove it? There's nothing in deployment stacks that allows you to do that. There are a number of options that you can use in Azure. For example, you can apply a lock to a resource. Now, locks are a bit of a double-edged sword because only owners or user access administrator role-given persons can change them. So you need extremely high privileges to again remove locks, which is cool when it's a lock on a very important production database, but it's very annoying when it's a lock on a database that everybody knows needs to go. So locks are a way for avoiding throwing stuff away you still need. Another way is backups. In general, backups are considered a good idea of important stuff. But I think if you really want to move to infrastructure as code, I think you should shift left. If you're going to change your templates and exclude a database from your template, which contains important state, that's the point where somebody should stand up and say, the fuck are you doing? And not just before execution. Because if you just before execution in production find an error, that's pretty late. I think that's one of the things we learned about deploying applications. Does that kind of answer the question? No, it doesn't answer the question. It gives you alternatives, I hope. It's good enough. Whew. Anyone else? Any thoughts? Things you'd like to see? User-defined types. Yes, of course, because anonymous objects suck, right? Okay. Template specs. Okay, that's 2. Anything else? Okay, referencing, of passing around complete resource references, because it's not the resources itself. All right. Anything else? Okay, I'll be here all day, so come find me if you want to see something else in action, but you don't want to shout through a full room. All right, user-defined types. Let's start by exploring the problem. So, what did I prepare? I have created my favorite architecture, which is an app service on an app service plan, and there is also some configuration going on for that app service. So basically, we're also using configuration as code here, using the same technical means as our infrastructure as code. What is it with these notifications? Go away. I'm trying to work here. Now, the problem here is that instead of doing something like this, my setting number 1 is beer, and my setting number B is, I don't know, soda. This is strongly typed. Now I know I need to have 2 settings that go into my app service. The thing is, if I want to pass those parameters through a number of files, I have to constantly declare parameters at the top, provide them to a subtemplate where I declare them at the top, and that's annoying. And this is where your media engineer steps in and says, I've got an ID that saves us a lot of typing. We're going to pass around object. So you're going to say, my app settings should just be an object. And you go into your parameter file, and here you specify those parameter values. And that works. It works wonderfully well and saves us a lot of typing, and everybody leaves the company, goes on and does something else, and then there is an update to the application code. It needs a new setting and nobody knows which setting. Or you need to change your infrastructure and you have no idea why you are passing certain values around. And this is the problem that we can solve with user-defined types. So instead of doing this as an object, I can say I'm going to declare let's do it different. I'm going to declare a type which I call my app settings type. And this type is going to specify the properties that need to go into that configuration. And then secondly, I declare a parameter that's of that type. Please observe that I'm using the postfix type here. That's not mandatory. It just allows me to have a type and a type definition and a parameter for the same thing in one file because they share a namespace. If I now go into the parameter file, let's remove this and say, hey, I need to add a parameter. I forgot the name. What's it called again? My app settings. And now I can say something like, now my extension, which is very broken today, should notify me what I'm missing. Let's try that again. Ridiculous. Now let's say my first setting, I want to put in this. You see, by the way, my JSON reflex here. Sorry about that. I'm kind of expecting warnings here, but I think I already see the problem. I am not referencing the correct file. There we go. What we now get is warnings about, hey, you're adding a property here that you shouldn't be using. So I remove this, and now I even get tab completion telling me which settings I'm missing. I think if I put DD in here, yeah, it's a string and it's optional. So this is a way for working with user-defined types. Any questions up to this point? Yeah, go for it. If they work on variables yet. Honestly, I've never tried it. So this is where it's going to be fun. Because variables are implicitly typed, right? You don't give them a type. So it's still thinking this is an object. Okay. As far as I know. No, there is no hinting in here that I know of. Maybe it's coming. But one thing that I can do is if I create how I'm going to do this, I'm going to say type demo type, and I'm going to call it demo.bicep, and I'm going to say setting, which should be a string. There we go. Then I can do something like export, saying, hey, I want to be able to reference this from another location. And I now say I am going to create a resource demo app service config, which is of Microsoft.web/site/config latest version, because the name should be app settings and the properties. And now I'm going to say I'm going to pass in demo value. Param demo value should be of demo type. There we go. Yeah, at some point I will lose track of all my trolls and la-la-las. And you can all laugh at me. What was I trying to achieve here? Now I can say import star from, I always forget the stupid syntax. So this is my pro tip. Don't try to remember anything that you can look up. Bicep import type syntax. Yeah, import. Yeah, I'm doing it right, am I not? Demo.bicep. There we go. Now I have a demo type, and now I'm going to say module 2, which should reference demo.bicep as well. Required properties, and now hopefully, yeah, so here it automatically detects the type and it picks it up. And if I now say demo value 2, I'm going to say var demo value 2 is, and I put in here my setting. This works, but if I put in this, I should be able to produce an error, because it cannot transform, and it's still not, yeah, it's still typed as object here, but it's going to figure out if it can map from that object to the type thing. I hope it was possible to follow along. Does that give you some indication of on what's possible and what's not? Nope. I'm at this point, if I was engineering right now, I would try something else. I'm confident I'm not going to find a solution in an appropriate amount of time. On the fly, I also saw showed that you can export and import types. This allows you to do neat things, like, for example, if you have a very long definition of the configuration for an application, you can actually write, ask the application engineer to write the type that you have to provide from the infrastructure, right? It allows interesting collaboration through text. And other things that I've seen is, for example, people creating a type that allows you to list all the valid values, for example, for role assignments in Azure. There are neat things that where you can use types to wrap up well-known values, for example, or valid values for an enumeration. Is that enough about user-defined types, or any other questions? All right, let's move on to template specs. What did I cook up here? Yes. So I created another template, which is a definition for a storage account. A typical scenario for things like the Bicep registry or a template spec is that companies start creating what are called blessed templates, or templates that you should use because they are scrutinized by security or architecture or any other department that finds itself important enough to interfere with your infrastructure. And what you then do, these templates, once they are approved, you put them into the template spec. And you get things like this. Hey, I'm going to create a storage account, and I don't really care. It's always going to be TLS 1.2 or higher. I do still allow you to enable or disable shared access keys because there are scenarios where you still need them. I'm looking at you functions. And then this I want to publish as a template that everybody in my organization can use. And I'm forcing them to use LRS or ZRS and not very expensive storage. So what I can do is I can write a command which is called AZ and then TS and then create, and I can use that to create the template spec in Azure. I have to give it a name and a version, and that version is not in any way verified. You can also use version A and then version B and then version C, but I would recommend you to go with 1.0 and then 1.1 or 2.0 depending on compatibility. You specify to which resource group it has to go, which location in Azure it has to host the resource, and then the file that you want to deploy. I'm just going to copy paste this because watching me type is rather boring. Now this will error out because it says, hey, you already have deployed version 1.0. Are you sure you want to proceed? And trying to be smart as I am, I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to make this 1.1. And it should be rather quick, and then the resource is created in Azure. So if we go back and switch over to my Azure environment, and then this resource group where I deployed the template spec, you can see that a new resource is being created of type template spec. I can open it up, and from here on, somebody who is not really into infrastructure as code, but every now and then needs to create a resource, can say, hey, deploy this template. And then in any location where they have the appropriate rights, they can deploy the template. They have to specify values for the parameters. And please observe, by the way, that I'm not being helped here by providing valid options for the enumeration. So I can put in my favorites, blah, troll, and beer. And then hopefully I would get validation errors when I try to deploy this. But this is a way where you can allow others to use that template spec. But of course, proper engineers that we are, we want to reuse it from another template. So I have created another template where I'm going to first deploy that storage account and then a function deployment. And because it is a function, I'm going to need access to that shared access key. Now you can see I'm using a very readable notation for deploying that the template spec. That's TS, colon, then the GUID for my subscription, slash the name of my resource group, slash the name of my template spec, colon, and then the version. And that works fine. I can deploy this, takes a minute or so, and then the resources are created in Azure. And of course you're going to love this, so you're going to expand this and you're going to reference that same template spec from hundreds of locations, and then somebody changes the location. Because that happens in the real world. So what you can do is you can go to another file which is called bicep config.json. JSON, why? I really don't understand this. We're switching from JSON to a new DSL for everything, and then the one file that we use for a configuration is still in JSON. I really don't understand. Okay, sorry about that rant. This is a configuration file where we can enable certain experimental features, but we can also define what are called module aliases here. So what I'm going to say, I'm going to create an alias for template specs, which is called myspecs. And here I put in the subscription ID and the name of the resource group that contains the template. And I put this in once in a central location. And now I can update my reference of the storage account to module trollolol storage account deployment. That should be TS. And then instead of a colon, this time we're going to use a slash for reasons unknown to me. But you see that I already get tab completion. So I'm going to say I'm going to reference my specs. And from my specs, I want to reference my storage account. And then v1.0. And if I've made no typos, I should be able. Sorry? Ah. Okay. What happens is the second that I make no mistakes, that template is pulled from Azure onto my local machine. It is transpiled if necessary, if it's still JSON, and I can do required properties, and I should be able to get tab completion here as well. Again, if the tab completion is working today. What? The reference ARM template has errors. Well, I'm pretty sure. YOLO. I tested everything this morning when I was very quickly preparing this impromptu presentation. And it seems that, again, we are running into a problem with the editor, and the template is fine. Which is a pity, by the way, because if you're working with Terraform, one of the things that I used to tell everybody is that the editing experience in code for Bicep is incredibly much better for Bicep than it is for Terraform. But lately, I've run into some issues every now and then. But this is how we are now using the template spec from within an existing template. Does that show you everything you wanted to see about template specs? Any questions? Okay, so we've seen template specs, we've seen user-defined types. What was number 3 again? References, resource types references. Yes, all right. And the deployment works. So, first of all, well, it's an experimental feature, which means that it probably works fine, but that you don't get any guarantees or money back when it fails. But it also means that we have to enable it. So again, we go to bicep config.json. And we find a thing called experimental features enabled, and then we enable something called resource typed parameters and outputs. And again, I don't know anymore. Tab completion, very nice editing experience, which in this case still works. So now we have enabled the feature. If you look at the problem, this is an example of the problem. I have a orchestrating template which first deploys a server farm and then deploys an app service onto that server farm. If I look into the template for that server farm, you see that I'm outputting the server farm ID because in my app service I need my service farm ID, also called an app service plan ID nowadays, so I can apply it. And that means that in my orchestrating template I have to pass it around from one template to the other. Now what we can do now is we can say, hey, I'm going to upgrade that output to be a resource. And then after resource, I can even specify which type of resource it needs to be, which version of the API I want to use, because that sometimes determines which properties are available on the object. And then I can reference a resource from within my template. And it also means that in my app service, I say, hey, I'm going to require a parameter named my app service plan of type resource and then of this specific resource type and version. Again, this is an example of strong typing. Because if this was still a string, I could pass in trollololol, it would transpile perfectly fine on my local machine. it will be pushed into Azure, half of my template would be deployed, and then the deployment would blow up. In this case, I can get transpile checks if I'm providing the correct thing. And if you're also working with, for example, role assignments and managed identities, you know there are client IDs, application IDs, and principal IDs. Well, these are great things that you can mix up when you start passing them around as string, instead of just the resource that they're coming from. So this is in a nutshell typed resources as outputs and parameters. Magnus. I so wanted to put everybody else in control, I forgot what I wanted to do. Sorry? You want to see support for Entra ID in Bicep? Yes. So the promise is awesome. One of the things that helped me back a lot when deploying code using infrastructure as code in Azure is that at some point you're going to need to create, I don't know, an Entra ID group and assign it some role and then make that Entra ID group the owner of your database. Now assignment on your SQL database you could do, but you could not create a group and you could not create, for example, an Entra ID role to that group. I'm still struggling with the renaming to Entra ID. So Microsoft has been working for quite a while on extension support for Bicep. And there is also an extension for Kubernetes, I've heard. I don't really know what Kubernetes is, but apparently it's awesome when you start working with it, but it gets worse every week you work with it. So I've never looked into that. But there is also support for Entra ID. And they've done it in an interesting way. Instead of creating a resource type like Microsoft.entraid/groups, they are starting to wrap the Microsoft Graph as a resource type. So there's a new resource provider, Microsoft.graph. And this is, I try to interpret this as a hint, and this is not NDA information or an insight that I have, but I'm really hoping that at some point, everything that is in Graph and can be approached in an idempotent way will become available using Bicep. Did you hear me, Microsoft? So how does that work? I have a template where at the top this morning I had provider Microsoft Graph, but the provider keyword is deprecated. We now have to specify extension, and this enables the extension for Microsoft Graph, which means that I can now start using resource types of Microsoft.graph/star. To allow extensions to work, again I have to enable an experimental feature. So no guarantees, no promises from Microsoft. I have to set extensibility to true. And now I can do things like, hey, I want to create a new group in Entra ID. I'm going to call it Database Administrator Group. I can specify members and some of the other features that you might expect when you're familiar with Entra ID. But one thing that might be new is this unique name. Unique name is a new property that has been added on objects in Entra ID that you can approach using the Graph resource provider as a means for uniquely identifying resources in Entra ID. Because for reasons that I don't know, but are probably valid, they cannot use the GUIDs or other properties that are supposed to be unique. And I'm going to bet my ass that it has something to do with Active Directory synchronization and the very long history of Active Directory. So this unique name property that I'm referencing makes sure that I'm not going to create a new group every single time with the same display name, because display names don't have to be unique in Entra ID. And that unique name has to pre-exist on that group in Entra ID if I want to make sure that I don't recreate a group that already exists. So that's a bit of a barrier to entry for using this. But if I only want to create new groups, that's not a problem, because I can choose a unique name and then keep using that same name forward. I can add members, and very recently an update has been added, meaning that the principal that deploys the template automatically becomes the owner of the object that is created if the object supports owners. So if you create an app registration or a group from your pipeline automatically becomes the owner, so your pipeline can also remove it or manage it in the future. Now, This is great, and I can do this for groups, and I can do this for users, and a number of other objects that are supported. However, it's not unique. Because I tried something, I said, hey, let's see if I can reference an existing group and then add members. There's no support for this right now. I just checked this morning, and I ran into another blog post by somebody else stating that this is still not possible. So I'm going to rely that it's not possible yet. Probably going to change in the future at some point. But right now, when you reference an existing resource using Bicep, you cannot manipulate any of the properties. So I cannot do things like members and then try to add members. Another limitation is that I can only add members. It is not that I can idempotently and complete declare the list of members to be, with automatically members being removed. So there are still a number of limitations. However, if you want to do straightforward scenarios like creating a group, adding members, setting owners, etc., that's possible right now. If you want to do a bit of a more elaborate example, what I tried to do in this template, create a group, add some members, assign it to a SQL DB, you're going to run into a number of limitations. So circling back to calling it awesome, yes, it is awesome that this development is going on, and I know that the team is working really hard how to use a non-idempotent API like Microsoft Graph from an idempotent construct like the Azure Resource Manager, and I'm pretty confident they will figure it out, and that we will see more happening in this space. And it's actively under development. Almost every day I see PRs flying by. That's a thing that I'm most enthusiastic about for the future going forward for Bicep. And that means that we have 8 minutes left. Is there anything else that you'd like to see, or random questions, things you'd like to discuss together? Yes, go for it. So the question is, using GitHub Copilot for Bicep is not really working well because it's using older versions, older references, etc. If I have found a better way. Bit of a confession. I don't use GitHub Copilot. I am not a big fan of AI because a model that is trained on mediocre shit on the internet is very likely to produce more mediocre shit, in my opinion. And I know that's not true. And I know, and I've dabbled a bit with it, and I've seen some of the amazing things that it can do for generating outlines and doing, especially things that are repetitive. But I don't do that a lot in my work anymore. When I work on a problem, it's always very specific. And I find it indeed falls short when you do want to do something very specific or very niche or very up-to-date, because those models are trained on older data. Now that problem will probably go away. It will become much better. And at some point I will step in and be amazed by everything that I missed out on. But right now, I don't know. I have no way for making it better. And this is a very personal view, by the way, that's not shared by a lot of people. Anything else? Yeah, go for it. So the question is, there are a lot of built-in types as well, and then you mean those on the resource types. And if we can use those as types as well. Not that I know. So you mean when I do I'm going to do ARM template reference. And let's that one. Subscription, policies. Then there is something that doesn't have any. Okay. Logic, integration accounts, and it says this has to be an integration accounts queue. You mean these types? Not that I know of, and I don't think so as well, because I don't see how that would fit in what they're building right now, and I think these names are not unique. No. I highly doubt it will ever come. Sorry. Anyone else? All right, then I'm going to try and make some friends. If you leave now, you're first in line for lunch. Thank you.